This talk is on hadith and the pious networks that transmit it. So I'm calling it hadith and piety networks. Hadith, as you know, are sayings by and about the Prophet Muhammad that were passed on through the generations by these muhaddithun, these transmitters of hadith. And that what I'm going to talk about in this presentation are both some of the issues that come up within the Islamic world about hadith transmission, some of the critical historiographic or critical historical issues that Western critical scholars have brought to this literature in this field. And finally, I'm going to introduce a clip of a colleague of mine who's also a Muslim, who was participating as a Muslim in the gathering and transmitting of hadith. Okay, first of all, a single hadith has two parts. These two parts are the isnad and the matan. The isnad being that chain of transmission that you already saw on the individual reports of Tabari's history. The matan being the text this time. So in history we call that text a khabar, and hadith we call it a matan, which you can just means basically a text. So the isnad being something like Muhammad ibn Bashar heard it from Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, who heard it from Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi, who heard it from Sufyan, who heard it from Salama ibn Kuhail, from Hujr ibn Anbas, from Wa'il ibn Hujr, who said. So that after the who said, we go from the isnad to the matan, and this is the matan of this. I'm reading from the Tirmidhi handouts. I heard the Prophet read the Quranic verse in prayer, and the verse being, and not those rejected by God, no, those who have gone astray. And then he said, Ameen, stretching out his words. So obviously there was some question in the community about whether or not one stretches out the word Ameen. And that's a hadith clarifying the matter. And the chain of transmission is the isnad. In the discussion of the authenticity of the hadith, which is an important question for the Muslims, not just Westerners, it's the isnad which is, in most times and places, of greater value. In other words, one assesses all the links on that chain of transmission. One assesses them for the quality of the transmitters. In other words, were they pious figures? Were they trustworthy? Is it plausible that they were teachers and students? In other words, do the dates match up? That it was plausible that teacher heard it from that student, or that transmitter heard it from that transmitter. All of these things go into isnad criticism, which is a major field. So this question of authenticity, the authenticity question, is an issue both for the medieval Muslims and for Western scholars. In other words, both are asking really the same question, in which a couple of you have asked in another, and I noticed in the discussion groups in another context, how do we know these hadith are authentic, or is there any kind of native, indigenous, within the Islamic tradition form of criticism? And in fact, there is. A lot of it has to do with the criticism of the isnads I just talked about. And there is a real, the allegation is made that there are untrustworthy hadith transmitters, and there are those who are fabricating hadith. So the criticism, hadith criticism, is a part of the Islamic tradition. Interestingly, though, there's some overlap between Western historians and medieval Muslims on these questions, but interestingly, one impulse within the Islamic society is to say that if everybody agrees that a hadith is authentic, and it's been spread for so long, over so much time and space, and it's been repeated on the mouths of the Muslims from generation to generation, that hadith, whether or not there's an isnad going back to the Prophet, should be understood as if the Prophet was remembered as having said it. So they'll use the expression rafa'a to raise a hadith to the Prophet because the hadith has been shown to be so well attested across the community that it will actually, its popularity will gain it a sense of authenticity. It's an interesting and quite different approach to authenticity than we might call the skeptical approach of Western hadith critics. So after the 9th century, so we're now 2 or 3 centuries into Islam, there came to be established 6 books that were in the Sunni world taken as essentially beyond reproach. I mean, all the hadith in these books, this collection of hadith, were beyond reproach. And the 2 most important of these are called the Sahih, which means correct, as in unimpeachably correct isnads, compiled by Bukhari, and another collection also called the Sahih, compiled by Muslim, both of these in the mid to late 9th century. These 2 books, the 2 Sahihs, are essentially practically on the in terms of their unimpeachability, that is the confidence that Muslims have that they're authentic and a source for law, is really take their place alongside the Quran. In other words, they're that important. So it'll be quite common for a Muslim to have a copy of Bukhari in his or her home. In other words, and really part of it is that they're, unlike the Quran, which is crucially important for liturgical purposes and also just for inspiration. The hadith do better as a guide because they're organized, at least the Bukhari is organized topically. So if you're really looking for what's the model of the Prophet for a bill of sale or for marriage or for how to wash oneself before prayer, you're going to have an easier time and you're going to have a much fuller version consulting the hadith. So let's talk a little bit about the Western approaches to authenticating hadith. First of all, there's this what is known as the common link, and connected to it, the partial common link theories. And this is that the more transmission lines there are, and the more that come together or are knotted with a certain transmitter, the more likely is that this transmitter, this point of transmission, has an authentic claim of historicity. So in other words, if you make a chart of the lines of transmission of a particular hadith, and you go through all the hadith books and you see them clustering around a certain generation or a certain transmitter, that's probably the point when it came into the Islamic world. In other words, that's the point when, I guess one might say, it was fabricated. And before that, it probably wasn't present. So just to give you an example, I'll show you one slide of one of those lines of transmission. So this is a nice clear one. You can see that, in other words, Suleiman at-Taymi, after his generation, this hadith was everywhere, and before it was, going back between him and the Prophet, there's very few lines of transmission. So the common link theory is that it's most likely that the hadith came into, in other words, started at the generation of Suleiman at-Taymi, and then at some point it was retrojected back to the Prophet to establish it as a prophetic hadith. So the common link here being Suleiman at-Taymi, and you can see there's a whole bunch of students who attribute it to him. Now, there were criticisms of this theory, and one important criticism came from Michael Cook and his fabrication principle. So his fabrication principle goes something like this. You've got a certain transmitter, called the transmitter A, and this transmitter heard a tradition from one of his colleagues. But they're kind of in competition in a certain sense because they're both trying to establish themselves as having good old chains of transmission. So you don't really want to get a tradition from a contemporary, because it lengthens your chain between yourself and the earlier and the prophet. So what he says is that it's really the generation after the common link. If we go back to our slide, I'll continue. So what he's saying is that if you have, for example, this, if you look at the common link as Suleiman Taimi, and then you have all of these people, Ma'mar, Hushaym, Soroyan, Ma'mar, all these people, it's likely that rather than Sufyan, for example, heard it from Suleiman Taimi, he heard it from his colleague next door in the same time, Huthaym, but he didn't want to attribute it to him, so he attributed it back to Suleiman Taimi, the same source. So, in other words, so Michael Cook would push it up a bit further than Taimi, and at some point, in other words, he would push it to the point when there's the generation when it's everywhere. That's when he would say it's distributed, not the earlier one. So let's turn from the literature of the hadith and the criticism of the hadith to the forms of instruction. In other words, what are some of the ways that these hadith are passed down, and what's the technical terminology? Well, first of all, one has to get a hadith orally. You have to get an oral audience of the hadith. And to hear a hadith from someone is called a sama', an audition. Sama' just means to hear. So it's really an audition, A-U-D-I-T-I-O-N. In order to authenticate the fact that you've heard the hadith correctly, you read it to the person you audited it from. And this is called the qira'ah. So you qara'a ala, you read it to the teacher. So really, if you get one of these hadith notifications, to say you read it to the teacher meant that you were tested by the teacher, essentially. And then if you satisfy that test, you get what's known as an ijaza, a permission, permission to teach license. And that can come either orally, or often it comes if there's a text in question. In other words, if someone has made a nice copy of these traditions, you actually get, the person will actually write that they give the person permission to transmit the source based on their authority. And so in this way, you get a person-to-person chain of transmission forming through these auditions. So I wanted to give you a couple of just primary sources to fill in. This is an example of a snad criticism, right? So we talked about it. So how does that work? Here, this discussion, again, is right from Tirmidhi, one of the passages I gave you. And in my view, both the traditions of Abu Salma from Abu Huraira and Zayd ibn Khalid from the Prophet are genuine because it has been related to Abu Huraira from the Prophet through more than one chain of authorities. Muhammad, however, thinks that the tradition of Abu Salma from Zayd bin Khalid is the most correct. On the subject, there are traditions related by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Ali, Aisha, Khalid, Anas, Abdullah ibn Amr, Habiba, and Ibn Omar. So here you have, in other words, a discussion of the isnads and the relative merits. And so it's really this that people are arguing about, not the content. Again, this is another primary source, this one on academic procedures. I quite like this one. One of the rights of the scholar is that you should not be persistent when questioning him, nor gruff when answering him, neither be importune if he is tired, nor catch hold of his role when he rises to depart. Do not point to him or spread private information about him, or speak ill of anyone in his presence. Do not seek out his failings. When he slips, wait for him to recover and accept his apology. You must revere and esteem him for the sake of God. Do not walk in front of him. If he needs anything, you should make haste to serve him before the others. You should not find his long company tedious, for he is like a date palm you are sitting beneath, waiting for a windfall. When you arrive, greet him in particular and all those who are present. All this should be for the sake of God. For a learned man receives more reward from God than someone who fasts, prays, and fights in God's path. And when he dies, a hole appears in Islam, which remains until the day of judgment, unless it be filled by a successor who is his like. The seeker of knowledge, moreover, is accompanied by the angel of heaven. This is Qadi Ayad of Quetta in 1149. And so what you really have here is these people, the transmitters of tradition, who are a subset of the scholars, the ulama, view their activity as really the highest calling. So it isn't only about, it's both about the knowledge and it's also its pursuit, the seeking of knowledge, which really is taken to be the height of Muslim piety by this community. Effectively, what's created by the teaching or by the transmitting and receiving of these traditions and their memorialization through these lines of transmission that are also memorized is a scholarly network, or many scholarly networks, and the overall effect of the formation of these scholarly networks is toward ultimately unity and conformity. I think. In other words, the pressure and principle in Islam is always, at least in Sunni Islam, is toward accepting a common core of beliefs, values, traditions, practices through the weight of the tradition as it's passed on through the generations. So in other words, on the one hand, it's far less well-defined than you have in something like the Catholic Church, where there's a very well-established orthodoxy set by a leader, the pontiff, the pope, with the bishops, and it's codified. Islam, it's not like that. You've got all these different scholars who are mastering material, transmitting traditions, but because they require the authorization of one another and of the past, and the overall effect, I think, of that is to establish effectively these networks where repeating what's gone before you and mastering it has the effect of a kind of conservatism. And I mean, the positive way to spin it is, or to put it, I guess, is it's a tradition which views knowledge as something which is extremely important to preserve. And I think that has a unifying quality within the Muslim world. At least that's my view of it. It allows for difference and a type of eclecticism because everything is preserved, but also unifying, and that you all are together in preserving it and in accepting these the weight of the bulk of the scholars on any particular tradition. A couple of things on the classification of the collections that reinforce this, in particular the Musnad collection. Musnad is, you can tell by the root, the SND in there, Sin Nun Dal. Musnad is a collection which is organized by Isnad, by a hadith transmitter. So if you want to look up all of the hadith narrated by a certain transmitter, say Ahmad ibn Hanbal, important transmitter, you look under, A. Ahmad and find his name, and then you can see every single hadith he transmitted. On the other hand, you also have what are known as Musannaf collections, like Bukhari, which are organized by topic. So those you can imagine are used for what? For legal purposes, or for guidance purposes. So you can look up all the hadith pertaining to charity, or all the hadith pertaining to purity law, or all the hadith pertaining to tort law. What happens if someone has an accident on your porch? Anything. These are massive, multi-volume collections which cover pretty much every aspect of life. Finally, around the hadith, there are these ancillary genres which developed to help with the authentication of hadith, authenticating hadith, such as the biographical dictionary, and we saw that in terms of the biographical dictionary pertaining to the judges before in our on the first class. But you have biographical dictionary entries on hadith transmitters, and this is useful because, again, it's a tool which can be used to authenticate a particular tradition, the isnad of a particular tradition. Because if in other words, if it says so and so heard it from so and so, and you want to see, wait, did this really happen? Well, you can turn to the biographical dictionary, look up the hadith transmitter, find out what's his death date, find out where he was and when he was where, and does it make sense? He could have heard the tradition. So again, it's a tool for isnad criticism. And finally, you have these other ancillary genres like this arba'inat. And here I'm going to refer you to this really fascinating colleague of mine, Jonathan Brown, who's both a scholar of Islam and also a Muslim, well, an alim of a sort, a traditional Muslim scholar, of a Sunni variety, type of liberal Salafi, really. And I met him in Yemen when we were doing independent research there, but he had this project to collect hadith that were transmitted by the Prophet in a direct chain of transmission into a book of 40 hadith. And this is an old, as he'll explain, an old tradition in Islam that scholars would do of these arba'inat books, these books of hadith that you collect from all over the Islamic world that are prophetic traditions that go back with the shortest chain as possible to the Prophet. What I love about Jonathan's interview is that he really emotes to the question of why this is meaningful to him. It's toward the end when I get more. He's didactic. He likes to teach because he's a professor. But toward the end of the lecture, I press him a little bit, and he does reveal like what does it mean to him to collect hadith. So I did this interview maybe 10, 12 years ago, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.